Imagine discovering that your family heritage hides secrets so terrifying they could cost your own children their lives. And stay with me, because this story will chill your blood until the very last revelation that will forever change your perception of what lurks in the shadows of our ancestral homes. The pounding rain violently struck the car windows as Thomas Moreau carefully drove on the winding road leading to their new dwelling. His wife Claire nervously clasped her hands on her knees, while their two children, Emma and Lucas, slept peacefully in the back seat. This imposing Victorian house stood before them like a dark sentinel in the October night, its black windows reflecting the lightning that streaked across the tormented sky. Grandmother Marguerite's inheritance was finally in their hands. After months of complex legal procedures and endless administrative paperwork, Thomas parked the car in the graveled driveway that cracked under the tires, creating an ominous sound that startled the children awake. Emma, age 12, rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked out the window with an expression of instinctive mistrust. Lucas, 3 years younger, huddled against his sister, whispering that he was afraid of this big house that looked like those from horror movies. Claire got out of the car first, her heels clicking on the wet cobblestones as she observed the Gothic facade adorned with grimacing gargoyles. The marble columns framed a massive oak entrance door carved with strange motifs that seemed to move in the flickering light of the street lamps. Thomas unlocked the door with the ancient key the notary had given him, wrought iron key so heavy it seemed to have been forged in another era. The creaking of the door echoed in the cavernous entrance hall, revealing a dusty interior where furniture was covered with ghostly white sheets. The musty smell mixed with something more disturbing, a metallic and acrid scent that Thomas could not precisely identify. Claire turned on the main switch and the crystal chandelier suddenly illuminated the entrance, casting dancing shadows on the paneled walls. The portraits of ancestors with piercing gazes seemed to follow their every movement, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made the whole family shiver. Ma immediately noticed that all the portraits showed men and women with deep black hues, as if the same genetic curse ran through the generations. Lucas hid behind his father's legs, whispering that the people in the frames looked mean and scared him. Thomas reassured his children by explaining that these were simply their ancestors, and that they should respect the memory of those who had lived in this house before them. Claire discovered in the main living room a grand piano covered with a thick layer of dust, its keys yellowed by time, seeming to wait for an invisible hand to touch them. A library occupied an entire wall, filled with ancient volumes with cracked leather bindings, some so old their titles had become illegible. Thomas randomly opened one of these books and discovered yellowed pages covered with Gothic writing in a language he did not immediately recognize. The drawings in the margins depicted strange creatures, mysterious symbols and diagrams that resembled occult rituals. Claire called her husband from the kitchen where she had discovered a pantry filled with jars containing unidentifiable substances preserved in cloudy liquids. Some jars bore handwritten labels with dates going back several decades, even more than a century. Emma explored the first floor and discovered that her future bedroom was decorated with floral wallpaper faded in places, revealing dark stains on the walls. The window of this room looked directly onto the family cemetery located in the back garden, where a dozen tombstones were aligned under a 100-year-old oak tree. Lucas categorically refused to sleep alone in his assigned room, claiming he heard whispers coming from the walls. Thomas and Claire decided that the whole family would sleep in the master bedroom this first night. To get used to their new home, the night was agitated with unexplained noises, crackling in the walls, creaking of the floors on the upper floor, and sometimes the muffled sound of a melody played on the living room piano. In the early morning, Thomas went down to check the piano and discovered with amazement that the lid was open and an ancient score was placed on the music stand. This score bore the title Requiem for the Innocents and was dated 1863, written by the hand of his great-great-grandfather, Edouard Moreau. Claire prepared breakfast in the kitchen, trying to ignore the persistent impression of being watched by invisible eyes. The children ate in silence, Emma constantly staring at the window overlooking the family cemetery, while Lucas refused to look in that direction. Thomas decided to explore the house more methodically to inventory what they had inherited and discover all the secrets of this ancestral dwelling. In his grandfather's office, he found an ancient safe whose combination was written on a piece of paper slipped into the desk drawer. Inside the safe were legal documents, family jewelry, and especially a notebook bound in black leather bearing the inscription Family Chronicles. This notebook contained detailed accounts of events that had occurred in the Moreau family for more than 2 centuries, written by different generations. The first pages told the story of the property's acquisition by his ancestor Barthélémy Moreau in 1789. Shortly after the French Revolution, Barthélémy had bought this house at a ridiculous price because it previously belonged to a family of guillotined nobles, and local superstitions claimed it was cursed. The accounts mentioned strange events, objects that moved by themselves, nocturnal apparitions, and especially mysterious disappearances of village children. Thomas read with growing unease the testimonies of his ancestors, who described secret rituals practiced in the house's basement. These rituals were supposedly aimed at preserving the lineage by offering sacrifices to an ancestral entity that had protected the Moreau family for generations. The notebook mentioned the existence of a condemned basement accessible through a door hidden behind the main living room library. Thomas hastily closed the notebook, initially refusing to believe these stories he attributed to the superstitions of his ignorant ancestors. However, his curiosity was stronger than his reason, and he headed toward the library to verify the existence of this secret door. By carefully examining the shelves, he indeed discovered that an entire section of the library pivoted on hidden hinges. Behind this false library was a rusty iron door, closed by 3 massive bolts and a padlocked chain. The smell that escaped from behind this door was even stronger than that which permeated the rest of the house, a mixture of mold and something more disturbing. Thomas went up to get tools from the garage to force the locks. Despite an inner voice advising him to leave this door closed forever, Claire found him coming down with a crowbar and a powerful flashlight, and she insisted on accompanying him in this dangerous exploration. They sent the children to play in the garden, strictly forbidding them to enter the house during their absence in the basement. The first bolt gave way easily, as if it had not been closed for a very long time, but the other 2 resisted more. When Thomas broke the chain with his crowbar, metallic creaking resonated throughout the house, seeming to wake something that had been sleeping for a long time. The door slowly opened onto a stone staircase that descended into the absolute darkness of the condemned basement. The air that rose was laden with humidity and this metallic smell that was becoming more and more identifiable, dried blood mixed with other decomposing organic substances. Thomas illuminated the steps with his flashlight and noted that the walls were covered with symbols carved in the stone, similar to those he had seen in the library books. Claire followed him cautiously, gripping her own flashlight and trying to control her increasingly difficult breathing in this confined atmosphere. At the bottom of the stairs stretched a vast vaulted room, in the center of which stood a stone, all stained with dried brownish substances. The walls of this underground room were adorned with frescoes depicting ritual sacrifice scenes, painted with disturbing realism that suggested they had been created from life. In a corner of the room, an underground library contained hundreds of volumes devoted to the occult sciences, necromancy, and black magic rituals. Thomas opened one of these books and discovered it was written in ancient French, detailing procedures for invoking demonic entities in exchange for earthly powers. Claire drew his attention to a series of intimate journals aligned on a shelf, bearing the name of a Moreau ancestor and covering a period of about 20 years. The most recent journal bore the name of Marguerite Moreau, Thomas's grandmother, and its last entry was dated only 3 months before her death. Thomas opened this journal with trembling hands and began to read his grandmother's terrifying confessions. Concerning the continuation of rituals, Marguerite described how she had perpetuated the family tradition by offering regular sacrifices to the ancestral entity that resided in the depths of the earth under the house. These sacrifices consisted mainly of orphan children or those from poor village families whom no one would come looking for or miss. The journal detailed minutely the dates of these sacrifices, the names of victims when known, and the benefits the family derived from them. Each sacrifice was followed by a period of family prosperity, abundant harvests, business success, protection against diseases and accidents. Marguerite explained that the entity demanded a sacrifice of an innocent child. Every 7 years to maintain its protection over the Moreau lineage. The last sacrifice mentioned in the journal dated back 14 years, which meant the entity had not received its due for 2 complete cycles. Marguerite expressed her growing terror at the entity's anger, which was beginning to manifest displeasure through increasingly violent paranormal phenomena. She had tried to break the ancestral pact by condemning the basement, but the entity had made her understand that only death could free her from her obligations. The last pages of the journal revealed that Marguerite had chosen to commit suicide rather than continue feeding this family curse. However, she warned that the entity would automatically transfer its demands to the next male heir of the Moreau lineage, namely Thomas. Claire discovered another journal, even more recent, which bore no name on its cover but contained entries dated only a few weeks ago. This anonymous journal described the surveillance of Thomas's family, observation of their habits, and especially the thorough study of the 2 children, Emma and Lucas. The author of this journal knew intimate details about the family's life, Thomas's work hours, Claire's activities, the children's school routes. It was evident that someone was continuing the family traditions and preparing the next sacrifice by specifically targeting Emma and Lucas. The journal mentioned that the entity had a preference for children of Moreau blood, as considered superior quality offerings. Detailed plans of the house were drawn in the margins, showing all possible accesses and the best times to kidnap the children. The author seemed to know perfectly the children's sleeping habits, their fears, and the most effective means to lure them into the basement. Claire read aloud a particularly terrifying entry that described Emma as the perfect candidate for the next ritual due to her age and spiritual purity. Thomas snatched the journal from his wife's hands, refusing to hear more. But it was too late to erase these terrifying images from his mind. They also discovered recent photographs of their children taken without their knowledge in the playground, in front of their old house, and even in their garden. These photos were annotated with comments on the children's physical and mental development, as if they were animals destined for slaughter. Claire began to panic, realizing that their family had been watched for months, perhaps even since the inheritance announcement. Thomas tried to reassure her, but he was himself terrified by the extent of the conspiracy surrounding them. They hastily went back up from the basement to check that their children were safe in the garden. Emma and Lucas were playing quietly near the family cemetery, unaware of the mortal danger hanging over their heads. Thomas immediately called the local police to report the threats weighing on his family, but the commissioner replied that this type of prank was common in old houses. Local authorities seemed unwilling to take seriously stories of satanic rituals and child sacrifices. Claire suggested leaving the house immediately and returning to the city. But Thomas realized they would be safe nowhere as long as the identity of the watcher remained unknown. That night, they barricaded all doors and windows, and Thomas stood guard with a hunting rifle found in his grandfather's office. Around 3 a.m, footsteps echoed in the living room, accompanied by the sound of the piano playing the same lugubrious melody as the previous night. Thomas went down silently with his weapon and discovered a hooded figure standing in front of the secret library. The intruder wore a black robe adorned with the same symbols as those carved in the basement, and his face was hidden by a wrought iron mask. When Thomas aimed his rifle at him, the man did not seem impressed and continued to manipulate the library opening mechanism. "You cannot stop what was begun centuries ago," said the intruder in a cavernous voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Thomas recognized this voice as that of Henry Dubois, the old gardener who had been taking care of the property maintenance for 40 years. Henry removed his mask, revealing a wrinkled face but with eyes shining with fanatic madness that testified to decades of devotion to dark forces. "Your grandmother tried to break the pact, but the entity chose me to continue the family work," explained Henry with a disturbing smile. He revealed that he was actually the illegitimate half-brother of Thomas's grandfather, conceived during a secret affair with a house servant. Henry had grown up in the shadow of the legitimate family, but he had been initiated into the basement secrets from a very young age. When Marguerite had tried to break the tradition, The ancestral entity had turned to Henry as guardian of the lineage. The children must be sacrificed before the new moon. Otherwise, the entity will destroy all the Moreau descendants, declared Henry, advancing toward the stairs leading to the bedrooms. Thomas fired a warning shot that exploded an ancient vase, but Henry continued to advance as if bullets could not reach him. Claire ran down with the children, alerted by the gunshot, and screamed in horror seeing the intruder in their living room. Henry extended his arms toward Emma, while murmuring incantations in the ancient language Thomas had seen in the basement books. Emma seemed hypnotized by Henry's voice and began walking toward him despite her parents' screams. Thomas threw himself at Henry to prevent him from reaching his daughter, and the two men rolled on the ground in a desperate struggle. Meanwhile, Claire gathered her children and pushed them toward the front door, but it was mysteriously locked from the outside. All the ground floor windows were also blocked by iron bars that seemed to have grown from the ground during the night. Henry managed to free himself from Thomas's grip and ran toward the children, brandishing a ritual dagger adorned with black stones. Lucas let out a scream of pure terror that echoed throughout the house and seemed to make the walls of the old dwelling tremble. At that instant, a blinding light burst from the basement, accompanied by a dull rumble that made the floor vibrate. Henry stopped dead, his eyes reflecting terror that exceeded even that of his potential victims. "She is coming," he whispered, backing toward the secret library. "The entity comes to claim her due herself." Shadow tentacles began to escape from the basement opening, sliding along the walls like living serpents. These tentacles seemed to be searching for something specific, brushing against furniture and objects before heading toward the smell of the terrified children. Claire held Emma and Lucas against her, whispering to them to close their eyes and not look at the ancestral horror rising from the depths. Thomas understood that their only chance of survival was to give the entity what it demanded, but he could not bring himself to sacrifice his own children. Henry sneered, seeing Thomas's moral dilemma, and explained that the entity would not stop until it had obtained complete satisfaction. "Your ancestors have fed this creature for centuries. You cannot break the cycle now," declared Henry, pointing his dagger at Emma's throat. At that precise moment, Emma seemed to emerge from her trance and bit Henry's hand violently, making him drop his weapon. The girl ran to her father, screaming that she had seen terrifying visions of all the children who had been sacrificed in this basement. Lucas revealed that he heard the voices of these dead children asking him to avenge them by destroying the entity once and for all. Thomas realized that his children perhaps possessed particular sensitivity to supernatural forces due to their genetic heritage. He remembered reading in the journals that some Moreau descendants had developed psychic powers, allowing them to communicate with the beyond. Emma confirmed that she could see the spirits of the victims surrounding the ancestral entity, keeping it prisoner of their collective suffering. These spirits had been waiting for decades for a Moreau descendant strong enough to break the chains that bound them to their executioner. Lucas added that he instinctively knew how to destroy the entity, but that it would require the voluntary sacrifice of an adult member of the Moreau lineage. Henry screamed that it was impossible, that the entity was immortal, and that only sacrifices of innocence could appease its thirst for blood. But Thomas understood that his children were telling the truth. The entity drew its strength from innocent suffering, and a sacrifice consented out of parental love could destroy it. He kissed Claire and his children one last time, then walked resolutely toward the basement opening from which the shadow tentacles emerged. "I voluntarily sacrifice myself to free all the innocents you have devoured," declared Thomas in a firm voice that echoed in the tenebrous depths. The entity let out a howl of rage that shattered all the house windows, understanding that it was about to lose its source of power. Thomas slowly descended the stone staircase, followed by the tentacles that seemed to hesitate to seize him, destabilized by this unexpected offering. Dear viewers, we have arrived at the heart of this terrifying family story. And if you want to know the continuation of this ultimate sacrifice and discover if Thomas will manage to save his children from the claws of this ancestral entity, subscribe immediately to our channel and activate the notification bell, because your support gives us the strength to continue telling you these spine-chilling stories. And do not forget to check the link in the description to participate in our exclusive contests that might make you win frightening surprises. In the basement, Thomas discovered that the entity was not a unique creature, but an amalgam of tortured souls that had been corrupted by centuries of bloody rituals. At the center of this mass of shadow and suffering was the spirit of Barthélémy Moreau, the first ancestor who had concluded the demonic pact. Barthélémy had been transformed into eternal guardian of this family curse, condemned to orchestrate the sacrifices to feed the entity he had created through his greed. Thomas understood that to break the cycle, he had to not only offer his life, but also forgive his ancestor and free his soul from this spiritual prison. Barthélémy Moreau, in the name of our entire lineage, I forgive your sins and I break the chains that bind you to this cursed existence, proclaimed Thomas. A golden light began to emanate from his body, contrasting with the darkness surrounding him and making the shadow tentacles retreat. The spirit of Barthélémy appeared in his original human form, tears flowing on his face deformed by centuries of eternal remorse. Thank you, my descendant, murmured Barthélémy before disappearing in a burst of pure light that made the entire basement structure tremble. The entity let out a final howl of agony as all the imprisoned spirits freed themselves simultaneously, creating a luminous whirlwind that sucked in the darkness. Thomas felt his strength abandoning him, but he smiled knowing that his children were finally safe, and that the family curse was broken. On the ground floor, Claire and the children saw the entire house tremble on its foundations, while lightning bolts burst from all openings. Henry Dubois let out a cry of horror, seeing his occult powers abandon him, his body aging several decades. In a few seconds, collapsed on the ground, becoming again a simple, defenseless old man, also freed from the demonic grip that had kept him artificially alive. Emma and Lucas felt that their father had accomplished his sacrifice, and that the voices of the dead children were extinguishing one by one, finally at peace. The house stopped trembling, and a deep silence settled, more peaceful than anything they had known since their arrival. Claire carefully went down to the basement and found Thomas unconscious, but alive near the stone altar that had collapsed on itself. All the macabre frescoes on the walls had disappeared, replaced by drawings of smiling children who seemed to say goodbye before fading away. The underground library had turned to dust, taking with it all the black magic grimoires and cursed journals. Thomas opened his eyes and smiled, seeing his family reunited, realizing that his voluntary sacrifice had been accepted without it being necessary to die. Paternal love and sincere forgiveness had more power than centuries of hatred and ritualized violence. Henry Dubois was taken away by authorities who found him in a state of advanced senility, unable to remember his crimes. The Moreau family decided to stay in the house, which was now purified of all malevolent influence and filled with an atmosphere of peace. Emma developed a gift for communicating with benevolent spirits, helping other families solve their paranormal problems. Lucas became a spiritual healer, using his psychic sensitivity to help people overcome their traumas and fears. Thomas and Claire transformed the basement into a meditation center, where visitors came to seek inner peace and family reconciliation. The family cemetery in the garden became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to honor the memory of innocence and ask forgiveness for their ancestors' sins. Every 7 years, on the anniversary of the spiritual liberation, the family organized a commemoration ceremony for all the children who had lost their lives. These ceremonies attracted families from around the world who came to witness their own reconciliation with their painful past. The ancestor portraits in the entrance hall had mysteriously changed expression, now showing serene and benevolent faces. The transformation of the house was so complete that even the village neighbors noticed that the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the property had totally disappeared. The living room piano began playing spontaneously again, but this time, soothing melodies that lulled children and comforted adults. Claire discovered in the attic a collection of letters written by Marguerite before her death, explaining that she had always hoped that one day someone would be strong enough to break the curse. These letters revealed that Marguerite had secretly preserved blessed objects and protective talismans throughout the house to help her descendants. Thomas also found a spiritual testament from his grandmother in which she bequeathed to the family the mission to transform this cursed house into a healing sanctuary. The basement wine cellar, which did not exist before, mysteriously appeared filled with century-old bottles containing blessed water with healing properties. This miraculous water attracted pilgrims from around the world who came seeking healing from their physical and spiritual ailments. Emma began having prophetic visions that helped her guide visitors toward resolving their family problems. She saw ancestral traumas that were transmitted from generation to generation and helped families break these destructive cycles. Lucas developed the ability to purify haunted places simply by laying hands on them and channeling the peace energy he had received. The two children worked together to transform cursed houses into serenity refuges, perpetuating the reconciliation work begun by their father. Thomas wrote a book about his experience, becoming a recognized spiritual guide for those struggling with family curses. His book, Breaking Ancestral Chains, became an international bestseller, helping thousands of families overcome their traumatic legacies. Claire opened a transgenerational therapy school in the east wing of the house, welcoming therapists from around the world. This school taught how to identify and heal wounds that are unconsciously transmitted from parents to children over several generations. The property garden transformed into a botanical paradise where each plant had specific therapeutic properties. The red roses that grew near the family cemetery had the power to soothe grief and facilitate the mourning process. The lavenders that bordered the paths calmed anxiety and promoted restorative sleep without nightmares. The 100-year-old oak tree became a wishing tree where visitors hung ribbons bearing their hopes for family reconciliation. Each year during the spring equinox, the tree was covered with thousands of colored ribbons representing as many healed families. The living room library mysteriously reconstituted itself with works devoted to psychology, spirituality, and transgenerational healing. These books appeared spontaneously according to visitors' needs, as if the house itself prescribed the readings necessary for each person. Henry Dubois, despite his senility, sometimes found moments of lucidity during which he implored the Moreau family's forgiveness. Thomas visited him regularly at the hospice, offering him sincere forgiveness that allowed Henry to die in peace a few years later. The story of the Moreau house transformation inspired the creation of an international movement of ancestral reconciliation. Similar centers opened around the world, each adapted to the cultural and historical specificities of its region. Grew up to become a renowned medium specialized in communicating with ancestors to resolve unresolved family conflicts. She developed a unique method allowing the living to dialogue with their deceased ancestors to obtain their forgiveness or blessing. Lucas became a modern exorcist who did not use traditional methods but the power of unconditional love. He traveled around the world to free houses and families from negative entities that had attached themselves to them. Thomas and Claire aged, surrounded by their children's love and the gratitude of thousands of families they had helped heal. Their house became a pilgrimage site, where people came to seek inspiration to overcome their own family challenges. The basement transformed into a meditation center, hosted spiritual retreats led by masters from different traditions. These retreats combined meditation, family therapy, and forgiveness rituals to offer holistic healing to participants. The reputation of the Moreau House extended to prestigious universities that sent their psychology students to do internships there. These students learned in the field how traumas are transmitted and how they can be healed through love and forgiveness. Emma married a young psychiatrist she had met at a conference on transgenerational therapy. Together, they had 3 children, who all inherited psychic gifts they used to help their fellow humans. Lucas chose to remain single, to devote himself entirely to his mission as traveling healer, journeying from continent to continent. He never stayed long in the same place, but his reputation preceded him wherever he went, attracting those who needed help. Thomas created an international foundation to fund research on transgenerational traumas and their healing. This foundation awarded scholarships to researchers worldwide to develop new therapeutic approaches. Claire published a series of practical guides to help parents break negative cycles before they affect their children. Her books became references in the field of conscious parenting and trauma prevention. The Moreau house became a global symbol, of the possibility of transforming evil into good through the power of love. Documentaries were made about the story of this transformation, inspiring other families to face their own demons. 20 years after the entity's liberation, the family organized a grand ceremony to commemorate this victory of love over hatred. Representatives from all the families that had been helped came to testify their gratitude and healing. Emma, now an adult, had a prophetic vision showing that other houses in the world harbored similar entities. She understood that her mission was to train a new generation of healers to free these cursed places. Lucas agreed to direct this international Academy of Spiritual Healing that was established in the different wings of the family property. This academy taught spiritual liberation techniques to students from all continents. Thomas, now elderly, spent his days meditating in the garden, thanking daily the divine forces that had guided him. He sometimes felt the benevolent presence of his liberated ancestors who watched over the family and blessed their work. Claire organized talking circles for women who had experienced similar family traumas. These circles allowed participants to share their experiences and support each other in their healing process. The mysterious cellar continued to produce its miraculous water, which never ran dry despite growing demand. This water was distributed free to all who needed it, without distinction of religion, race, or nationality. Scientists tried to analyze this water, but could never explain its properties through conventional physics laws. They concluded that its healing effects belonged to a phenomenon beyond current scientific understanding. Emma had 4 children, who manifest exceptional psychic abilities from a very young age. These children seemed immune to any negative influence and radiated an inner light that soothed all who approached them. The youngest of these children, a boy named Gabriel, showed signs of universal clairvoyance. He could simultaneously see a person's past, present, and future, helping them understand the origin of their problems. Lucas personally trained Gabriel, transmitting all the spiritual healing techniques he had developed during his travels. Gabriel already surpassed his uncle in the extent of his powers and the depth of his compassion for human suffering. Thomas lived long enough to see his great-grandson Gabriel born and understand that the Moreau lineage was definitively transformed. On his deathbed, he had a vision of all future generations of his family continuing the healing work. Survived her husband by 5 years, devoting this time to transmitting her wisdom to new generations of therapists. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren who felt her soul joyfully liberate itself. Inherited the direction of the family foundation and extended its influence to all continents of the planet. She established transgenerational healing centers in 100 countries, training thousands of specialized therapists. Lucas, despite his advanced age, continued his missionary travels to free the last cursed houses on the planet. He had developed a world map of places requiring spiritual intervention and worked methodically to purify them all. Gabriel grew up to become the most powerful healer the family had ever known, surpassing even his parents' abilities. Was already capable of liberating entities that experienced exorcists could not drive away. The Moreau house became the global headquarters of a reconciliation movement that now touched millions of families. Political leaders came to consult Gabriel to resolve ancestral conflicts between nations and ethnicities. The family's influence now extended to the geopolitical level, helping to prevent wars and reconcile enemy peoples. Gabriel developed a revolutionary technique for healing collective traumas affecting entire populations. 50 years after the ancestral entity's liberation, the transformation was complete. Evil had been definitively vanquished by love. The Moreau lineage had become synonymous with healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation worldwide. Emma, having become a respected old lady, wrote the family memoir so this story would inspire future generations. She described how a cursed family had become a source of blessings for all humanity. Lucas, a centenarian but still active, trained his last disciples before retiring definitively to the family home. He spent his last years meditating in the transformed basement, preparing his soul for the great journey. Gabriel took over from his great-uncle and revolutionized spiritual healing methods through his innovations. He developed techniques allowing instant healing of traumas that would have required years of therapy. The Moreau house was now visited by millions of pilgrims each year coming to seek peace and healing. A small town had developed around the property to welcome all these visitors seeking spirituality. The miraculous water from the cellar was now distributed globally by a network of devoted volunteers. This free distribution had allowed healing of incurable diseases and reconciliation of broken families on all continents. Gabriel married a young woman who shared his gifts, and together they had 7 children with even more developed powers. These children represented the culmination of the Moreau lineage's spiritual evolution, embodying the perfection of unconditional love. The most gifted of these children, a girl named Light, could heal by her mere presence without even needing to touch the sick. She radiated such pure aura that negative people could not approach her without being transformed. Emma died at 100, surrounded by hundreds of descendants who had all inherited exceptional spiritual gifts. Her death was celebrated as a festival because everyone knew she was joining the liberated ancestors in a higher plane of existence. Lucas followed her a few months later, passing away peacefully after having accomplished his mission of purifying the world from malevolent influences. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one under Gabriel's direction. Gabriel centralized all global healing centers under a single international philanthropic organization. This organization now employed tens of thousands of therapists trained in Moreau methods. The family's reputation was so great that entire governments called upon their services to resolve crises. Gabriel advised presidents and kings, helping them govern with wisdom and compassion. Light developed a mystical school where she taught gifted children how to use their powers for humanity's good. This school attracted children from around the world who showed signs of precocious psychic abilities. The Moreau house was now classified as World Heritage by humanity as a unique spiritual healing site. The UN officially recognized the importance of this property for world peace and its preservation. Gabriel lived more than 120 years, continuing to innovate in the field of spiritual healing until his last days. He personally trained more than 1,000 healers who spread his method across the entire planet. Light naturally succeeded him, becoming the most respected spiritual leader of her time. Under her direction, the family organization evolved toward a form of global governance based on love and compassion. Thomas Moreau's descendants were now so numerous, they formed an international community of several thousand members. All shared the same values of healing, forgiveness, and selfless service to humanity. The transformation of the cursed lineage into a blessed family was so complete that even historians struggled to believe this evolution. Universities created chairs of study devoted to the Moreau phenomenon and its sociological implications. Light had a prophetic vision showing that all humanity was about to enter a new spiritual era. This era would be characterized by the progressive disappearance of violence and the emergence of a benevolent collective consciousness. The Moreau house became the symbol of this possible transformation of humanity, proving that even the most ancient evil could be vanquished. The story of this family still inspires millions of people today to face their own inner and family demons. 100 years after Thomas's sacrifice, his descendants spiritually governed a large part of humanity through their example of love. The ancestral curse had become the greatest blessing humanity had ever received, transforming the world through the power of forgiveness. This story teaches us that no curse is stronger than a parent's unconditional love for their children, and that sincere forgiveness can transform the deepest darkness into brilliant light, proving that no situation is hopeless for those who choose love over hatred, reconciliation over revenge, and self-sacrifice over selfishness. Because it is in these difficult choices that the true greatness of the human being is revealed, capable of breaking all destructive cycles through the sole force of their transformative love.